Now, this could prove to be a crucial week for Ukraine. U.S. President Donald Trump's push for a quick end to the war could result in ground-shifting talks between Washington and Moscow. But Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky insists that his country must be part of any deal.
I will never accept any decisions between the United States and Russia about Ukraine. Never. And our people, never. And our adults and children and everybody. It can't be so. This is the war in Ukraine against us, and it's our human losses.
Zelensky met with U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio on Friday, but he will not be included in the upcoming talks. Rubio is going to lead the American delegation in discussions that are going to be held in Saudi Arabia. The Kremlin has now confirmed that the meeting will be held tomorrow, with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov heading up the Russian side. Rubio has signaled that the talks at this point are exploratory, and he adds that both Ukraine and Europe will have a seat at the table when the real peace talks begin. Meanwhile, European leaders are holding an emergency meeting about Ukraine today in Paris. We are showing you a live shot right now of the Palais d'Elysée. That's where many of the meetings will be taking place. Now, CBC's Crystal Gamansing is tracking those details for us from London.
It's a gathering to demonstrate European unity and signal to U.S. President Donald Trump and his administration that those on this side of the Atlantic do take defense and security seriously. It comes as the U.S. gets ready for bilateral talks with Russia in Saudi Arabia on Tuesday. Secretary of State Marco Rubio arrived Monday in Riyadh ahead of those talks and was welcomed by the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Ukraine is not at the table yet, and European leaders were not invited to these early talks, so they're looking at their next steps. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer came to the table early, pledging British troops on the ground in Ukraine as a part of a security guarantee.
The position, as I see it, is this. We're facing a generational challenge when it comes to national security. Obviously, the immediate question is the future of Ukraine, and we must continue to put Ukraine in the strongest possible position, whatever happens next, and to make sure that if there is peace, and we all want peace, that it is lasting.
Now, it's unclear if other allies will follow suit, but the move does signal a dedication.
You know, the UK is not in a military position to issue a guarantee like this by itself. It might not even be in a position to issue such a guarantee either with allies, because it could be a very substantial undertaking. But certainly the hope that by giving a guarantee like that early, or saying the UK would take that position early, that it will help to pull in commitments from other big and rich, but perhaps more hesitant European countries, in particular like Germany.
Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk reiterated his country's unwavering support for Ukraine. His goal for the emergency summit in Paris was for European nations to take practical action to increase defense capabilities. Otherwise, he says they won't be in a position to help Ukraine in the long term. Since Russia's full-scale invasion in February of 2022, the West had been firmly united in Ukraine's corner while isolating Russian President Vladimir Putin. U.S. President Trump has said his priority is to end the war. Crystal Gamansing, CBC News, London.
We are joined now by a former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. John Herbst served as the ambassador in Kyiv under U.S. President George W. Bush, and today we've reached him in London. Ambassador, thank you so much for making time for us today.
My pleasure.
Ambassador, I wonder if we could please begin with the comments we just heard from the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky about this absolute reluctance and defiance to move forward with any sort of deal where they are not at the table. Does that bode ill of the conversations that are going to take place in Saudi Arabia between Washington and Moscow?
I don't think it is a good thing that Zelensky is not there, but I also don't think it's a critically bad thing. If it were to happen, which I do not expect, that Moscow would agree with Trump's general terms to reach a settlement, Ukraine's interests would be protected. But the Kremlin has shown no interest in compromise. They want to talk to the United States. They want to reestablish good relations with Washington, but not without giving up their aggressive designs in Ukraine. And I don't think Trump is going to be willing to accept an improvement in relationships with Moscow if Moscow is still conducting an aggressive war against Ukraine.
Let's talk about the Trump administration for a moment, because so much of it is unpredictable. And I'm wondering, from your vantage point and your expertise in the area, what is Rubio going to bring to the table in those conversations?
I can't be sure of what he will bring to the table. What I do know, however, is that the Trump team, going back to at least late November or early December, before the inauguration, were speaking about 4 elements to achieve an end to the war in Ukraine. 2 of those elements require compromise by Ukraine. Territorial concessions, 1. A moratorium of at least 20 years on NATO membership, 2. 2 elements require serious compromise by the Kremlin. 1 is this concept of a demilitarized zone with European peace enforcers. The other is arming Ukraine to the hilt to deter Russian aggression. Zelensky's indicated a willingness to compromise, at least on territory. The Russians have dismissed Trump's terms, and they've reiterated at every point that their idea of peace is Ukraine is basically disarmed, and of course, no European troops or any NATO troops, NATO member troops, on Ukrainian soil. So the Russians have dismissed Trump's terms. Lavrov will try, and Putin will try, to persuade the Trump team to give up those terms. I don't think Trump can do that.
I want to get back to NATO and the European, perhaps, lack of presence in the conversation, but let me ask you about the location where these talks are going to happen, Saudi Arabia. Now, Saudi Arabia has presented itself as a broker, as a negotiator in regional issues in the Middle East. But is this new territory? Why is that conversation taking place in Saudi Arabia?
Well, I think that the Saudis do talk. They do have good relations with us. Sadly, they also have good relationship with the aggressive country, Russia. And so that makes them a possibility for a place to meet which is not seen to favor either side.
So then that brings us to Europe, which clearly President Trump and representatives of his administration, Pete Hegseth, J.D. Vance, who were both in Europe and Brussels and Munich over the past week, and really criticizing their European counterparts and NATO in general. So we've heard from Rubio, at least, as we're pulling together all the different branches and the representatives of the administration. Rubio has said, yes, Europe will be at the table once the real peace talks begin. But Europe hasn't waited. And today in Paris, they're having this emergency meeting, this session on how to move forward with the possibility of supporting Ukraine. What's your best understanding of what's going to happen at that meeting? And is anything concrete going to come out of it?
I think that the single best thing that has happened over the last week towards an eventual stable peace in Ukraine has been the recognition by Europe's leaders that they have to seriously put together a proposal to put peace and forces on the ground in Ukraine. This concept was not on the table in Europe 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. This is a very important development. And I think Rubio has hit something that's very important, that of course Europe has to be at the table when things really get going. And there has to be a very serious conversation and perhaps negotiations between the US and Europe so that Europeans know how America will help them in this delicate and dangerous mission.
Does that mean, sir, that perhaps some of the criticism coming from the Trump administration towards its European partners is fair?
I think this means that Trump's hard-nosed approach has hastened Europe accepting its own defense burdens, true both in terms of spending and now in terms of risk and a possibly kinetic situation on the ground.
Ambassador, before I let you go, with the time that you've spent in Ukraine and understanding the region as well as you do, I wonder, are you in touch with any of your colleagues back in Kyiv or in other parts of the country? I mean, what is the sense? We're coming up on the 3-year anniversary of the invasion. Who could have predicted we'd be 3 years into this? Certainly not Russia. They said 2 weeks and it'd be done, and it's not. What are you hearing from folks back in Ukraine and what their hopes are at this point?
I am regularly in Ukraine, and I'm in touch with Ukrainians every week. So I'm quite familiar with their views. Ukraine has fought valiantly and bravely and essentially fought the Kremlin to a standstill. And frankly, there were people who knew, myself and many of my colleagues back 3 years ago, before the big invasion, that if Russia did invade, they would not have an easy victory. And that was proved right. We also knew that when the Biden administration was too weak to provide the Ukraine the weapons it needed before its 2023 offensive, counteroffensive, that it would not make great progress because they were not prepared by the Americans enough. So Ukrainians have no alternative to fighting. Because as the Ukrainian mayor said to me, it's bad to live under Russian bombs. It's far worse to live under Russian occupation. So they have no choice but to fight. And if we provide them enough support, they'll be able to defend their country. And if we provide them even more support, they can kick the Russians out of Ukraine. But I don't think that's the intention of the Trump administration.
All right, we'll wait and see what comes of those talks. John Herbst is the former ambassador for the United States to Ukraine. Thank you so much for your time today, sir.
Thank you. My pleasure.